Pete was sort of the everyman when this happened. Right? He'd been working as a postal worker. He was a dad. He spent time with his children. And then sort of the unimaginable happened.
There's good police work and there's not so good police work. And I can even understand how sometimes an overload of work causes people to do less than a perfect job. I just hate the fact that they did less than a perfect job and cost me so much of my life.
Pete's father was an elderly gentleman who lived on his own. And Pete discovered that his father's housekeeper / home health aide had been stealing from Pete's father. Pete got his father away from this woman named Kathleen Schroll and started to figure out how much damage had been done. Kathleen had begun working at a bank and had begun embezzling from that bank. April of 2008, Kathleen knew that her embezzlement was about to get discovered. So she began laying the groundwork, and her plan was to commit suicide, murder her husband, and frame Pete for it. She took a gun out of her purse, shot her husband. Then she placed a phone call to her mother, wakes her mother up, and tells her mother, Pete's here. He's already killed Carl, who was Kathleen's husband. He says he's going to kill me. And then her mother says, did you call the police? And she says, no. And then the line goes dead.
The person that arrives on the scene, the first officer who doesn't know about that phone call, looks at the scene and concludes very quickly, this is probably a murder-suicide, just by the way the scene looked. And once that phone call was kind of in the air with law enforcement, everything else was ignored. Any evidence that contradicted it, any evidence that supported Pete's protestations of I'm innocent was just ignored. It was that thing we call tunnel vision.
So at that point, based solely on that phone call, Pete is arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. At the first trial, Pete is found guilty of murdering Kathleen and found not guilty of murdering Carl. For the second trial, the prosecution finds a new witness named Robert Rupert.
Robert Rupert, the infamous jailhouse informant, found himself in trouble and in custody as they do. He called out and said that Pete had, made these statements, basically confessed to the killings, and offered, all these details, which of course were blatantly wrong, just based on the crime scene photos. You could see that, and nobody seemed to be bothered at all how inaccurate it was just on its face.
50-year-old Olin Coones is facing 2 murder charges.
In April of 2008, Kathleen and Carl Schroll were shot and killed inside this KCK home.
Right? He was convicted of a crime he didn't commit. He was torn away from his kids who were there with him while he was getting arrested, and served 12 years for a crime he didn't commit because evidence that the state knew hadn't been turned over that would have proven his innocence. So Pete's case was one of the first cases that came out of the Conviction Integrity Unit in Wyandotte County. And so the Conviction Integrity Unit had started their investigation, and they had determined that they were starting to believe that Pete was innocent.
This case goes back to court with shocking new allegations that Pete Coones was set up. Investigative reporter Angie Racona reveals new evidence in an old murder and speaks directly to the accused.
The Midwest Innocence Project was really a saving grace for us. I don't know that anybody would have believed us if they hadn't jumped on board and looked at everything and said, no, we believe.
Pete's was one of those where it happened quickly. We present the evidence, the state agrees, the judge agrees, he went home, there's no more appeals, it's done, right? And he can just say definitively it's done, he's exonerated, and in theory should have been able to re-begin his life.
A few years down the road, it's just a speed bump in the rearview mirror.
I got a phone call from him, and he said, I just want to keep you updated. I went to the doctor and they found, a mass on my lung. Like, they don't think it's cancer. They're going to go do a biopsy. So I just want to keep you updated, but nothing to worry about. Everything's fine. Okay. What his doctors would eventually discover is that Pete's body had cancer almost all over it. It was stage 4 cancer. It was in his lungs, on his collarbones, it was in his brain, it was in his kidneys.
Dad died 108 days after he was exonerated. It was difficult. It was painful. And it felt like the other shoe that I was waiting for to drop.
There's no excuse for it, right? He wanted to dedicate his life to making sure that what happened to his family didn't happen to anybody else. He thought he had all the time in the world, and he didn't. And it didn't have to be that way. If they had screened him properly and gotten him proper medical care, the type of medical care you or me or anybody else could have gotten, right? He'd still be alive.
Even if someone committed a crime, we are responsible for their health and safety, right? And what we do or don't do says everything about us. And so here you have Pete, who we have already failed because he was convicted for a crime he didn't commit. But then we fail him again by just not even providing adequate health care, so that when we correct our error, he's not alive to even experience his freedom.